one of the things that make generalized Darwinism general is that it provides a general framework for understanding the prosociality. In other words, organisms, agents acting on behalf of others or their society as a whole. What are the conditions required to evolve that? And those conditions are sufficiently general that they apply to all non-humans, humans, AI agents, and anything that takes place on any planet, because it's a manifestation of Darwinian processes. And so if the future, the far future, no matter who's inhabiting it, is something worth wanting, it will need to be prosocial.
This is Daniel Fagelli. You're tuned into The Trajectory, and this is episode 18 of our Worthy Successor series, where we discuss the grand trajectory of posthuman life and where we would hope for it to head off. Today, we're focused on the broader set of evolutionary processes and how they define not just the changes we see in the biological world, but the cultural world, the technological world, and maybe even more. A eminent scholar in this domain, who I'm excited to have with us in this particular episode, is David Sloan Wilson. David is an evolutionary biologist. He's also professor of biological sciences and anthropology at Binghamton University. His ideas are exceedingly unique on where Darwinian processes and selection forces and variation play their role in myriad aspects of this emergent living system that we seem to be within, and provides a really interesting lens on where it might take us. So this is a unique episode in a few different ways. I'll save my comments for the end of the episode as always, but without further ado, we'll fly in. This is David Sloan Wilson here on The Trajectory. So David, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
We have so much to unpack. I think your work is extremely unique, and I let you know before we started rolling kind of what in particular I think is special and important about your work. You think about Darwinian dynamics in a broader context than most people do, that extends to governance, extends to culture, extends to technology, potentially extends well beyond us, when I think most people think of Darwinian dynamics in maybe a purely biological sense. You probably have a good way of nutshelling sort of your lens there. Can you lay out how you think about it differently and why you think it's crucial to do so? Because there's so many practical purposes.
Right. So, I mean, around the world now, when you say the word evolution, people hear the word biology and genes,
yes.
As you just said. But that's not the way it was, and it's not the way it is becoming. If you go back to Darwin himself, of course, he knew nothing about genes. For him, evolution had three ingredients: a variation. Organisms vary in just about everything you could measure. Selection, those differences make a difference. And heredity, offspring tend to resemble their parents. And it was on that basis, without knowing anything about mechanisms, that we could now think about the shaping influence of selection. We could explain the properties of organisms not just on the basis of their physical basis, but also on the basis of the shaping influence of selection, of natural selection. That's it in a nutshell. And Darwin and everyone back then, the first few decades of evolutionary theory, they speculated very widely on humans, what today we would call cultural evolution. We have William James and the pragmatists. We have Thorstein Veblen asking the question, why is economics not an evolutionary science, in 1898? And then all of that more or less came to a close with the advent of genetics, the discovery of Mendel's work, and all of a sudden we had a mechanism of inheritance, and that became, for the most part, the only mechanism of inheritance that evolutionary biologists thought about. That was called the modern synthesis, and some of us are also calling it the great constriction. The great constriction that left out other Darwinian processes, other processes that combine the ingredients of variation, selection, and replication. Now, great strides were made in the science of biology. They enabled the geneticist Theodosis Dobzhansky in 1973 to say nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, which we love to quote. I was a graduate student just entering the field at that year, but so much was left out. And so what only resumed starting in the 1970s, 80s, 90s was going back to basic, some evolutionary thinkers going back to basic and describing Darwinism as any process that includes these ingredients of variation, selection, and replication. So what does that include? Genetic evolution, of course. Epigenetic evolution, changes in gene expression, not gene frequency. Forms of social learning found in many species. Other species have cultural traditions. Forms of symbolic thought that are uniquely human. And then we get all the way to computer algorithms, basically, genetic algorithms, and the most recent manifestation of that, which is artificial intelligence, which could equally be called artificial evolution. So it's a blossoming of evolutionary thinking that, as I have briefly described, is both old and new. Both old and new. We have so much to gain from going back to early thinkers such as Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, the other ones that I've mentioned, who were more liberated in how they could think about evolution than during this so-called modern synthesis. Sorry for the long-winded answer.
No,
that's
exactly.
To keep my answers shorter as we proceed.
No, that's precisely what we're looking for. I have no complaints on my side. So you've opened up the can well to say that actually genes equal Darwinism is somewhat new and is a fettered version of an observation of a much broader sort of phenomena that we were observing in different strata. Now, some people would say, okay, well, I guess that makes sense, but how is culture like Darwinian? Like, I guess it's Darwinian because it's made up of things that are made up of genes, right, David? Or, hey, how could like policy decisions be seen as Darwinian? I mean, that doesn't really seem to make much sense. I mean, does it affect the survival of a species? Is that why it's Darwinian? But you really have answers here. And I think that you've framed a lot of these fields, and we're about to go, of course, into kind of the grand trajectory of intelligence beyond humanity. We're about to get there. But you framed this as not an interesting lens, but potentially a more accurate and useful lens to observe things that do not involve genes inherently within them in any regard. Can you maybe walk us through some of these areas people do not think are Darwinian and explain for us how those dynamics still apply and why this lens is actually fruitful if we want to make change?
Well, at a macro scale, I think we can say something that very few people would disagree with, namely that us humans, thanks to our capacity for culture, are able to pass on learned information better than any other species. So in most other species, when an individual learns something, it more or less stops when they die. It's not the mechanisms for transmitting that. They exist, but they're very weak compared to what humans are able to do. And so humans are able to transmit an enormous amount of learned information across generations, thanks in large part to their capacity for symbolic thought. So you can think of that capacity as an inheritance system, functionally equivalent to the genetic inheritance system, different in all of its mechanistic details, but nevertheless, functionally, both qualifying as systems of replication, basically. And what that enabled our species to do was to adapt to their environments much more quickly than by genetic evolution. Now, who's going to disagree with that? And so historically, we know that our species, and only our species, spread over the globe in an amazingly short period of time, adapted to all climatic zones, dozens of ecological niches, and then with the advent of agriculture, then expanded in scale to huge cooperative societies. All of that was a process of adaptation to their environments, in that sense, functionally similar to genetic adaptations, but much, much, much faster. So that's like the 30,000-foot broad brush view. I don't know how anyone could disagree with that, frankly. I mean, what's wrong with it?
I concur so monumentally that I knew I had to have you on the show. But I think some of it is a shined light. I'll bring up the humorous example we talked about off microphone that I thought was just a delightful way of looking at this. That some people would say, "Oh, that's different than I thought." You had a talk in a library with Sapolsky where you were speaking about applying the idea of Darwinism to almost everything, and religion sort of came up. Like, we'd think, okay, if these religious beliefs are like really adaptive and useful, then yada yada. So okay, maybe we need a religion that's like really close to science and encourages science. But like, maybe not really. Maybe, in fact, a religion can have all sorts of very strange views, but it can be a binding force that still ends up being adaptive in the sense of promoting its own proliferation. So you mentioned, I think, the Jains, and I'm not going to put, if I'm mis-explaining, you can let me know, but sort of like there are some Jains that don't eat any animals at all or harm any physical things at all or something. And they sort of go around and they check on all the other Jain homes and they beg for food. And in so doing, they're kind of low-key enforcing stringent Jainism in those households, because you don't want the Swami to show, I don't know what they call the guy. You don't want him to show up and not be the ideal Jainist, right? And so he's kind of an enforcing mechanism, and that keeps the society very bound in very sort of tight ways. And because they're kind of a trading mercantile group for whatever reason, their tight-knitness allows them to cooperate well, allows them to have high trust at their trading junctures. And this enforcement of things that might be non-adaptive. In other words, they're like, some of them are kind of starving and, these non-adaptive things end up being meta-adaptive at these broader levels. So the individual biological impact, maybe not so much, but the broader impact more so. Like, those examples really shine forth to me. Anything you want to add to that, or other examples that for you showcase these dynamics in ways that maybe aren't intuitive to most people?
Right. So let me answer it in two stages. One is, I'm going to get there, and I'm going to get there through a little bit of a not a detour, but a interesting route. By first focusing on our genetically evolved senses, sight, hearing, touch, all of those. Let's take sight. What we know is that we don't just open our eyes and perceive the world as it really is. We can only perceive a very narrow portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. The rest of it is invisible to us. And even the portion we see, we break it up into colors, discrete colors, which don't exist out in the world. It's just a portion of the spectrum. Nevertheless, we colorize it. And the reason for all of that, our blindness to most of the world, is because evolution has been very frugal in what we can sense. Only that which contributes to our survival and reproduction. So the way we see the world is basically in a way that allows us to survive and reproduce in the world, and its relationship to what's actually out there. Mind you, there is something that's actually out there. The electromagnetic spectrum is out there. You'd be stupid to say that it isn't. But it required our instruments of science, both our conceptual and mechanical instruments of science, to perceive it. You can perceive it. There's nothing to other species perceive things that we don't. The Immense World by Ed Yong is a beautiful book on that topic. So the distinction between basically our organs of perception as evolving not to directly perceive the world, but to survive and reproduce in that world. We get that piece of it for our genetically evolved senses. Again, nobody could or should disagree with that. Now let's say the same thing about our cultural constructions. So how we see the world based on what's been implanted in our cultures. Those cultures have a long history, and it's there that you can now begin to understand how it's possible for human beings to believe in stuff that's just wacky, just to anyone who's a non-believer. And I'm not just talking about religions, my friend. I'm talking about any human being, secular or religious, having beliefs which, in the first place, are manifestly untrue, and in the second place, are perfectly easy to explain based on how they cause you to behave. And so this makes religion and its belief in supernatural agents, much easier to understand. And so the Jainism example is an example that's often been advanced by people like Richard Dawkins, the new atheist, to portray religion as a mind virus, basically, as something which is just good for itself, bad for humans, and to show that such things as ascetic renunciates who basically are, as you described, when you look at it, actually play a functional role in their communities. And now I've done research that, among other things, took a random sample of religions literally throwing the dartboard darts at the board of world religions, examining all of them. Jainism was just one of them, and showing that in each and every case, no matter how bizarre the beliefs might be to us, religion is all about community. It's all about community. And who said that? Who was one of the first to say that? Emil Durkheim. So you can go all the way back to his elementary forms of religious life. And what he says there is that, yeah, religions seem to be so otherworldly and so on, but on the other hand, if you really understand them, he said they have immense secular utility. Despite all appearances, they have immense secular utility. And another thing he said is that at all points in history, human society has only existed thanks to a vast symbolism. And so he was among the first to grasp how much our cultural constructions are, in the first place, any enduring culture is impressively adapted to survive and reproduce in its environment. You've got to admire any enduring culture in the same way that you have to admire any enduring species. I don't care if it's a disease or a dread predator or you've just got to admire its ability to survive. That's also true of our cultures. But of course, that's not to say that they have benign consequences. So we can get to that part soon enough.
Yeah. Well, there's so many things come to mind. I remember, when you try to find pure altruism in nature, in my opinion, you come up woefully short. Sapolsky's among many people that I think shows how woefully short you come up. I remember reading a story about some species of, I don't remember, some kind of burrowing muskrat of sorts, where there were some of these male muskrats that they would feed a bunch of extra food, and they seemed to actually do a lot less work. They would sit in the middle and they would just give them food, and they were like, oh, maybe they're being kind to one of the males who just sits here. But actually, as it turns out, when like a wolf would come to dig into the burrow, this male would like stick his rump, and his hips, I guess, had specific bones that would clog up the hole. And so they were fattening him because he was going to be of service at that time. And so even that was, so it seems maladaptive, but to your point, when you go up one level, there was actually a purpose for that. So these weird beliefs end up having purposes. Spinoza has this idea of adequate ideas. So an adequate idea for Spinoza is an idea which, when acted upon, will get you more of what you want. It will make you more powerful. He thinks of potentia as the total set of powers that permit a thing to not die. Flight, sight, verbal communication, technology, all is potentia, the unraveling of potentia in nature through and he didn't know a Darwinian process, but a Darwinian process. And when I think about, whatever the Jains might believe about the roly-poly bugs, I don't know if it's true or not. It strikes me as actually, it seems pretty likely it's not. But as it turns out, there can be, so that would seem like, oh, that's an inadequate idea, what they have in terms of like this notion of the divinity of the roly-poly bugs. But if it serves a purpose to be adaptive for that group, then it all comes out in the wash. Similarly to your point of, we look and we're not actually seeing everything that's coming in, but if it's seeing the things that let us persist and have children, it's working. And so working ends up taking on a totally different meaning, thinking through this lens. This is one of the things I think people can understand when they look at, to your point, cultures, religions, governance, species, etc. If it is persisting, it's doing something important. And I think you said, like, we should pay attention to, or at least acknowledge the importance of anything that persists like that, if I'm picking up.
Well, I did. And now having you talk about it, I'm actually going to backtrack on myself, if I might, and make some. These are really foundational points. And so I'm so happy we're having this conversation and hope that it's widely viewed. And so I'm going to backtrack just a little bit. And when you're a biologist, and when we get to humans, it will be no different. But when we begin, and I think much of what I have to offer is this, that I am trained as a biologist, as a field biologist. And if you look at the best place to find harmony in nature is inside any healthy organism. And so if you look inside any healthy organism that's not diseased, you'll find a symphony of cooperation. And and when you gave your example of the muskrats or whatever they were, and the ones that fattened up and then they played a role. Basically, you said, "Oh my golly, that group is more like an organism than we thought. We thought that they were just hoarding it for themselves. Now it turns out they played a role," which could be true. It could be true, but it could also not be true, and so. What we find in nature so often is that those organisms, which are so harmonious internally, are often at war with each other externally. And Darwin was acutely aware of this. He described nature as like 1,000 sharp wedges, all inwardly pointed and being hammered against each other. There's a letter that he wrote to Hooker that said, what a sermon the devil's chaplain could write about the horribly cruel and wasteful products of nature. Wasps that paralyze spiders and lay their eggs and, develop while the spiders do all these example after example after example. And so what you have is you have both examples of harmony and extreme examples of disharmony in nature. And it's a very important distinction that I'll advance here of two meanings of complex adaptive systems. This is like really huge for when we turn to culture. Meaning number one, so the phrase complex adaptive system. Meaning number one, a complex system that is adaptive as a whole system. That's what the words seem to imply. Meaning number two, a complex system composed of agents following their respective adaptive strategies. A complex system whose agents are adaptive, and they're all following their respective adaptive strategies. And now the great question is, when does that second meaning turn into the first meaning? It's the first meaning that we want. We want to live in complex systems that are adaptive as whole systems. Very often, we're merely living in complex systems that are composed of agents following their adaptive strategies. And those systems can last forever. So there's where I have to backtrack. Just because something's enduring, a despotic society can be highly enduring. A slave-holding society can be highly enduring. It might last forever. That doesn't mean that it's good for everyone within the society. And so we need a dose of realism. And as soon as I say all this, people are going to say, well, yeah, of course. I mean, who would be so naive as to think that all of nature functions like a single healthy organism? So this is like huge. And when we get to humans, culture, what we do consciously, all of our current groupings and so on, we're going to come up against that distinction between something which is adaptive as a whole system, that's what we want, and something that is merely agents colliding with each other.
Well, we absolutely will get into that. And I have some questions I'm just burning to ask and very excited about. Just to touch on what you've mentioned, I mean, the idea of the brutality of the fecundity of nature, I mean, is absolutely, obviously, vastly predates Darwin, of course, right? I mean, Lucretius writes gorgeous verse about this at monumental length, and Samuel Johnson has Rasselas, and there's works of fiction and nonfiction that touch on that. And I think it's hard to actually look at nature and to look close and actually not see that. I mean, you look outside and you're this lovely green forest or whatever, but it's just things. It's like most things are dying while being eaten alive, kicking and screaming, like most things. But in a weird way, those agents acting on their own behest, beetles competing with beetles and birds eating different insects and, other owls killing birds and whatever. It's like this is sort of working in the sense of the net set of powers of the system has seemed to bubble up to higher and higher sets of powers over time. And so what, in my opinion, what is nature trying to do? It's the mandate is to not die. For Spinoza, there's a conatus, which is the impetus to not perish, and you expand your potentia in order to behoove your conatus. The system seems to be expanding its potentia, even through the brute and horrendous fecundity that it conjures forth. So you're bringing up this interesting dynamic, and I don't know if this is philosophical, scientific. There's so many angles here of like, there's the one super healthy cell or super healthy field mouse, whatever it is, where sort of everything is really for the purpose of that thing. And then there's like, we could think of the economy. There's some sandwich shop down the road trying to put that sandwich shop out of business. But in general, I have more options for sandwiches. And, like people are having to get better at cooking. And like in general, it seems like it's still doing something clearly Darwinian.
Oh, I mean, there's lots of death that takes place inside individual organisms. And there's lots of competition that takes place inside individual organisms. Our immune system is a competition among our antibodies to successfully bind to antigens. And so this is not like anti-competition, but it is competition harnessed in the right you might say a managed form of competition. And so I think that all of what you said is true. The concept of regime, let me just expand upon that, because that's a human term that we understand. A regime is a social order which is somewhat stable. If it wasn't stable, we'd call it a regime. We would not call it a regime. But that says nothing about whether it's a benign regime that works well for everyone within it or a corrupt regime. So the issue of stability is different than the issue of equity and how well it functions actually for the good of all. And what you find is in both nature and human societies is that these stable configurations, first of all, there's lots of them, and they vary in the degree to which they are despotic versus more or less equitable. And the work of the most recent Nobel laureate in economics, Daron Acemoglu, this is what he does. His book, Why Nations Fail, makes a distinction between, on one end, inclusive societies, and on the other end, extractive societies. All of these are regimes. All of these have a degree of stability. But his work shows that the inclusive regimes work better at the society level. And so there is a degree of between regime competition. There's a degree to which if a regime is just, really not working for everyone, it's going to crumble, or it's not going to compete well with a regime that works well for everyone. That happens to a degree. And in that case, the more that happens, the more the regime becomes like an organism, a superorganism. And so this is possible, but it requires a process of selection, not just a process of selection, but a process of higher level selection, regime level selection. And now we're going to get to what we need when we talk about modern life. As we talk about evolution in the first place, can be conscious, it can be intentional, mindful. So that's another misconception we have to correct, the idea that evolution can't be a conscious process, that which is one of the dogmas that emerged from the modern synthesis. So once we decide that yes, actually, we can steward the process of cultural evolution, and then when we do, what we're doing is we're selecting at the level of whole systems. And if we don't select at the level of whole systems, then lower level selection is going to kick in, and we're going to get the kind of societies that we don't want. And so there's a very clear theoretical framework here that has been well developed. I call it present tense, not future tense, but so many people don't know about it. I mean, it's like the best kept secret of modern life.
I concur monumentally with a lot of your thoughts around. I've used phrases like sort of the aligning of incentives. Spinoza has this idea of potestas, which balances potentia, and he applies that to governance in his own philosophical work. But the Darwinian lens that you bring to it, I think is exceedingly accurate in many regards, and is going to be something we unpack at the end of the interview around innovation, regulation, moving things in the right direction is going to be a big part of what we cover. I want to dig into the meat and potatoes, and being mindful of time here, around the notion of worthy successor. So the reason I reached out, in addition to liking your work, is it struck me that it was not hung up on a set of sacreds that would prevent you from discussing certain things. It struck me as somewhat manfully frank looking at the world squarely, and not through sort of a wishing and a sentiment around what is going on, what has been, what is, what could be, and not inherently and eternally anthropocentric in a way that would be kind of sacred and bounding. So I'm going to ask the question this way. Same question we've asked a great many eminent thinkers. If, let's just say, 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years in the future, the great process that you and I are part of, this great flame of life of which you and I are a torch, continues and goes on and is stewarded well through its own means, or maybe through some nudges of humanity at certain junctures. And eventually, as it bubbles forth, there isn't, when you look down, let's just pretend you can be in a transparent eyeball somewhere in the universe. You can look down at where Earth once was or whatever. There aren't any more Homo sapiens sapiens, but the process that has bubbled out of it, the kind of life, complexity, beings, etc., that have sort of rattled forth from that great process. When you look down, you say, this really feels like a win. This is about as good as we could have hoped from this little Earth life that started with a single cell. This turned out well, even though it's not necessarily humans anymore. It's the main character. Like, this turned out well. What would you have to see to feel that way?
Well, I'd have to see something that looked like worldwide cooperation, the whole Earth as a superorganism, and that being respectful of the rest of life on Earth, not just humans. I don't want a planet in which humans are the only ones, humans and computers are the only ones left on the planet. That's a horrible prospect.
Yeah, surely. If all the dolphins die and all the, but just to be really square with you here, David, I'm talking about a time when there aren't people anymore. I'm being honest about the fact that in enough turns, in enough eons, individual torches aren't around anymore. So let us say that the shape you and I have isn't a shape that is a thing anymore. And presumably life is probably off of the planet Earth too. Maybe life is carried forth in substrates that are not guanine. Maybe guanine is not the only substrate housing life and complexity anymore. So there aren't people in this scenario, but you would still look at it and say, this is a flourishing and unfolding of what life was. As you know very well, David, the flourishing of life is not the eternal preservation of each individual torch that ever emerges. The proto-reptiles that you and I evolved from, that species isn't here anymore. The kind of archaea we initially were back in the old days, great-great-great-great-great-grandma, is no longer here anymore. Yet we are here. So I'm talking about a world where the flourishing has bubbled into, transformed into stuff that isn't appreciably, demonstrably human per se, but it appears to be flourishing, earthwise and otherwise. What would you have to see there? It sounds like cooperation's one thing. Keep going forward here. Of what
well, ProSociality would have to. One of the things that make generalized Darwinism general is that it provides a general framework for understanding the prosociality. In other words, organisms, agents acting on behalf of others or their society as a whole. ProSocial, anything oriented towards others or their society as a whole. What are the conditions required to evolve that? Yes. And those conditions are sufficiently general that they apply to all non-humans, humans, AI agents, and anything that takes place on any planet, because it's a manifestation of Darwinian processes. And so if the future, the far future, no matter who's inhabiting it, is something worth wanting, it will need to be prosocial. And it'll need to start out being prosocial. So I think that really, in some ways, I resist the thought experiment, or if I'm forced to indulge, I'd say that there's so much path dependence that whatever happens in the far, far future is going to be determined by what happens in the next 3 to 5 years. And so let's please return to the present and ask the question, in which direction is this AI revolution going to be going? Is it going to be going in the direction of really towards that CAS1 system, a system that's adaptive as a system, or not? Because that's the where we stand, the fork in the road that we stand at this moment.
Surely. So, and again, we've got a whole chunk of the interview focused on what we're going to do about it. But I think, David, if I'm really frank with you, the question of to what end is actually a really worthwhile question. Let us cooperate. To what end?
Why should we cooperate? Let me give you some examples of what other people have said, David. You don't have to agree with a single thing I say. I'm just going to tell you what other people have said. So here's some examples. Some people would say, by golly, those single-celled archaea, I don't think they were sentient. And it feels as though from early mammalia to Homo sapiens, we have this wider, richer sense of sentient range, from romantic love to enthusiasm, et cetera, et cetera. And the world seems more valuable now because there's more of that richness. Certainly there's some terrible suffering going on as well, but it seems like the possibilities that open up with this wider sentient experience, we should hope for even more of that. Some intelligences to experience things that are maybe even different than pain or pleasure, but they're rich and they're interesting, etc. Other people would say, David, and have said on the show, we as humans have been able to kind of organize and extend our powers beyond just biology into culture and technology. And there might even be strata of nature for which we have no access. Some grand posthuman intelligence could understand more of nature and act even more in alignment with what's going on in nature to get what it wants, to make sure it stays alive, to survive the explosion of our sun in however many billions of years. And that thing would understand nature so well that it could keep this flame of life alive, even better than humans could, because it's more powerful, right? You and I, David, our civilization, an asteroid of a certain size, we might actually be able to deflect it as humans. That's amazing. The sea snails, if everything stayed at sea snail, they would have not been able to do that. So a wider set of powers to keep life alive, man, by golly, it feels like that's a good thing. We want more of that. So if we succeeded, to what end? The end is not, unless it is for you, in which case you can lay it on the table. I don't think for most people the end is an eternal hominid kingdom where in 1 trillion years, it's just people going water skiing and walking their dogs and opening their refrigerators and things like that. I actually think that's stupid. And so I think actually, like, if we're honest about the Darwinian process you talk about, if we're honest about it, David, then I think we're talking about radical transformation over time. But to what end? Transformation to freeze things the way it is so we can all cooperate and sing Kumbaya for another 1 trillion years, or cooperation so that the bubbling process can bubble in a direction we would consider to be good? What would be a good bubbling? Some people have said, extended powers and access to nature. Some people have said extended sentient range. Some people have said the accumulation of knowledge or love or something like that. Like, to what end? If we all cooperated and there were higher forms of intelligence that emerged, why would that even be good? Like, what would you hope for there? Is it more joy? Is that what you want? Is it something else? Like, to what end for you, David?
I feel like a disappointment.
Go ahead, lay it on me.
Sometimes what I like to do in cases like this is to shrink it down, shrink the question down, and ask, what would that be like in, for a single group? What would flourishing look like for just a single group? And there, I think, and then you can, if you're able to answer that question, then you can expand it back up. And I think when you do that kind of exercise, and what would be the ideal group, flourishing group that you would want? Well, it would be full of trust, of course, and meaning and agency, and everyone would have a place in it. I think there'd be quite a lot of agreement on what that group would be. And we'd want nothing. And wouldn't it be great if the whole planet could be that all the way up until the extinction of the planet? So that if life goes extinct on the planet, it won't be just because the planet ran out of sunlight. It would be our own doing. And so I think, and then of course, if it is possible to colonize other planets, I'd like to do that in a way that's not colonizing. And when you look at the history of colonization, it is shocking when you think of it. The European nations, their track record colonizing other nations, and the degree to which they were just so completely exploitative. Oh my God, so completely. Even the nations that governed themselves well, when it came time to when they had power over other nations, how exploitative they were.
Well, I mean, I don't know if we can pin that on Europeans individually, David. I mean,
the Greeks, I agree.
The Greeks butchered the hell out of themselves. Go ahead and do your homework on South America, right? Go ahead and do your homework on China. I mean, like, let's the strong have done what the strong have done.
Exactly.
As far back as you want to go,
brother.
It's
all about power. No, I'm with you there. Yeah. I'm totally with you there. I'm not blaming Europeans. They're just the current occupiers of power. I'm 100% with you there. But on the other hand, we don't. So if we are able to colonize other planets, in what way are we going to do it? Are we going to do it that way, where we're the powerful ones, and then we just exploit it and bring all the resources back to Earth, and so on? And so I would not want that. If we do, I would want it to be basically to be some kind of, if we're exporting anything, it would be the flourishing that we've achieved for ourselves. And so, I think that's my answer, and I'm happy with that answer.
Yeah. So let's just clarify where you're going. So it seems like there's some discomfort with speaking of entities of potentially greater power than hominids individually.
No, I actually have no problem with that either. I'm very happy for there to be purely, in silicon versions. Intelligence. I don't have any problem with that. Merging, right? Of course, merging at all.
Yeah, that's
of course. Just historically, whatever our predecessors, our forebears are, historically they have to come from the human stock, and so they might look very different. They might be, look more like naked mole rats. They might just be, much less able to survive on their own, and mentally they might be just much more part of a group mind. Although the way that has to go is that they have to retain agency. There's quite a lot to be said about how becoming part of something larger than yourself, mentally and physically, is a form of freedom, not a form of bondage. And so there's a whole piece to be said that, again, at any scale.
And you're touching on some good points, and I'm going to keep things within the bounds of I guess what your answer was, which is there's obviously nothing wrong with your answer. Everybody's got their own answer. I've heard everything under the sun here. And so you bring up some important points about kind of, the Gaiac vision initially. There's a Gaiac vision of real collaboration and pro-sociality across the totality of intelligent life, which could involve some things that are way smarter than us, some merged humans that are sort of more developed and in certain different capabilities, who maybe can communicate with grand machine intelligences. And I would hope, and I think you would too, that let's presume there isn't any life on Mars, or maybe there's some exoplanet somewhere where maybe there really isn't any life. In that case, maybe we don't have to plunder anybody at all, but we can make sure that this intelligent living stuff that might experience, joy and whatever could kind of persist even beyond the Earth.
Sure.
But for you, it begins with cooperation.
Replication at some point has to be interplanetary replication. Otherwise, it will just be snuffed out, and nobody wants that.
Totally. And so keeping the flame alive feels like an important mandate. So from when you say, I'd want the coordination, part of what you're saying is I'd want the coordination because it would potentially make us stronger, more resilient, and more in our collective set of powers to be able to occupy different niches within the known universe that would permit this life thing to keep going, which this life thing you and I are a fan of would keep going. So part of you would want the coordination, the trust, the pro-sociality for a greater ability for life to stay alive, unless I'm putting words in your mouth. Does that sound accurate?
Yep, I'm happy with that.
Okay. Similarly, it seems as though you've talked about systems that persist but are tyrannical, or maybe a net detriment to a great percentage of the entities within it. That also feels like
AKA our current world.
Yeah. Our current world has more of that than I think most people would prefer, obviously. But yes. So and there's more. There's some. I think it's safe to say there's some nations where it's a little bit rougher than others, for sure. But to your point, we certainly have plenty of room for improvement there. But you would want a world where that's not the case. What I feel there is that you would suspect that would be a world where maybe there's a greater preponderance of joy to suffering than there would be today. If there was more of that pro-sociality. And if there were entities that were even bigger minds and experiences than humans, maybe they would experience more joy than suffering as well. So the expanding set of life would be more hanging out on the good side than in the suffering and terrible, oppressed and, terrible side. So is it also safe to say you would want the pro-sociality for hopefully a net better, I'm not calling you a utilitarian, but in this case, a utilitarian outcome, more good stuff than bad stuff in terms of feelings, that it would also lead to more of that? Is that one of the outcomes of why the Gaiac vision, the pro-sociality, is crucial for you? Or would you word it in a different way? I don't want to put words in your mouth at all.
Well, one thing I would point out, I don't disagree with it, but I think that we really need to be impressed by the diversity of internal states, the cultural diversity. So if we look at societies which are enduring societies, then what we find is, for example, things like the World Happiness Index are more or less assuming that the concept of happiness is something that's culturally universal. You can rank it on some kind of linear scale.
Yeah.
The concept of joy is the same thing. We want to be going around like this. Whee! Well, no, not necessarily. And there's so many cultures that are beautifully adapted as cultures. And it turns out that emotionally they're quite muted. This includes some hunter-gatherer cultures. I have a beautiful podcast with Vivek Venkataraman, who is an evolutionary anthropologist who studies hunter-gatherer cultures, including one in Malaysia. And one of the things he pointed out is how emotionally muted they are. One is never in anger. You don't express anger. That's like super important. Okay.
Whoa, interesting.
So, but also on the other end, you don't express joy. So he would go there, and he's in the tropical rainforest, and says, "Oh my God, look at that butterfly! Look at that amazing bird!" And they're saying, "Keep it down, keep it down." And then another
admiring the nature, damn it.
Another anthropologist, Jerome Lewis, who studies also hunter-gatherer societies, says they have no word for thank you, because it wasn't yours to give. And so I think that we have to be prepared for ways of thinking and feeling that are very different from our own. This is where the acronym WEIRD comes from, Western Educated, Industrial Rich, Democratic, coined by my great colleague Joe Henrich. And so, we've been mistaking our peculiar culture for human nature for a long, long time. And we need to do is just be humble. And we need to understand cultural diversity in all of its richness. And what we'll find are modes of kind of emotional repertoire which are very different from our own. And we could even find that at a smaller scale within our, the difference between, for example, evangelical religions and fundamentalist religions. If you're a scholar of religions, they're quite different from each other. And evangelical religions are much more emotive in terms of, your direct emotional connection to God and stuff like that. Something like the Seventh-day Adventists, they're much more actuarial in how they go about it, much more muted in their emotional expression. So you can see these differences playing out at all scales, including the individual, at the scale of the individual person. So this is part of being a good evolutionist, is to really appreciate diversity and not to be too one-dimensional when we talk about such things as happiness and joy and things like that.
Well, if we are to be really appreciative of diversity, David, would we not presume that there would be modes of mind that would have senses and perception and experience not only different from how we think about happiness, but entirely inaccessible even to our imagination, just as your enthusiasm with the thrill of discovering a scientific thing is completely inaccessible to a sea snail? I would think maybe we would need to start to appreciate the unfurling and unfolding of categories of experience and access for which we will never even have words. It would seem to me like the panoply of what opens up would be even more divergent than just human cultures. It could be as vastly expansive beyond we as we are beyond the sea snail. And there would be a diversity and a respect to the magazines of new experience that would open up to those entities as well, I would presume.
So two things. One is that's the theme of Ed Young's An Immense World. That basically,
I've got to read this book now. You've mentioned it twice.
Yeah, well, the concept of an Umwelt, it goes back a long, long way. How do we know how a bat sees the world, or any species sees the world? But now, because there's so much science around, the sensory abilities of other animals, including our companion animals, dogs, and so on. Moles. Electric eels, all of them,
yes,
because their sensory worlds evolved to help them survive and reproduce in the world, they're like super different than ours. Super. Now, can we understand them? I would say that, yeah, we have a chance in the same way that we can understand another culture, we can understand another species. We have to work at it. So that I agree with you basically that what I said for cultural diversity goes for
extends
organic diversity. Absolutely.
Or potentially even diversity that isn't made up of guanine, if we presume that at some point there may be intelligences and sentiences that aren't guanine
Well, totally.
based.
And I think that, you read the discourse on AI, and what they say is, we don't understand what we're evolving.
We don't.
We're setting up an evolutionary process, and then that is actually changing the mechanisms of what's going on, but we didn't directly change it. And it's going to be super complex. It's going to be hard work for us to discover exactly what goes on. And it's almost as if it's like molecular biology and neurobiology. For us to understand the mechanisms behind how we work, then that just brings you into all the mechanistic sciences, molecular biology, genetics, neurobiology, all of that kind of stuff. Can I be profane? Fucking hard work.
Yeah.
And it turns out
You're allowed to be profane, yes.
And it turns out that it's going to be the same with AI. It's going to be understanding how AI works is going to be like understanding neurobiology and molecular biology. It's going to be hard work, despite the fact that we set it in motion in terms of setting a variation, selection, replication process in motion. So that's a really interesting comparison.
I'm right there with you. So I'm going to nutshell. We're going to move into this how to steward the process forward, which I know you're excited to talk about. Let me nutshell the end of this initial question of what would David see flourishing as. There might be some boundaries that are tough for you to touch on, but in general, cooperation, pro-sociality, all the way up to the level of the earth, it would allow the process of life itself to persist better if we coordinated in that healthy organism way and got closer to that. That's one thing. Second, it would be better for the individual sentient entities. And you're bringing up a great point that better does not mean happy-go-joy for everybody. Better means whatever their own definition of better is. A sea snail or an electric eel, in your example, might have something that feels really pleasurable to them or is enjoyable to them that we don't understand, but we would hope that they'd have a good time, And so in general, agents would have a better experience, better by their own terms, a more preferable experience, and life itself would have a better chance of carrying forth if we were more pro-social and we behaved more as an organism rather than kind of a battling ecosystem per se. Is this an accurate or inaccurate nutshelling? I'm trying to figure out, you want pro-sociality, why? And it feels like the agents will get more of what they want, and the process of life will be more likely to coordinately extend itself and expand itself in a way that's, benign and useful, but also keeps life alive. What would you correct about that, David?
Oh, we're close enough, so I don't need to collect it.
Okay, we'll close enough. Good enough.
Well, I'll end by saying, just by stressing the close connection between inner and outer. So on the one hand,
Yes.
when we talk about what we want, we talk about some kind of inner experience, which we might experience as joy or fulfillment or flourishing or something like that. That's an optimal internal state. But then that internal state has to lead to action. And now we pass to the outer as to how sustainable the social forms that we've created for ourselves are. And unless the inner leads to the outer, then of course, then there would be a disconnect that we don't want. I don't want some kind of happy state on the inside and then have things deteriorating on the outside. Nobody does. But
Totally.
And at the same time, I don't want things that work well on the outside and keep us miserable on the inside. So that inner-outer distinction and the need to work on both, I think, is a very important message. It might seem obvious in retrospect, but it's really important to keep in mind because there's many cases where we can't change what happens on the outside without change what happens on the inside. So that dialectic basically is very important to keep in mind.
And I want to double click on that one more time. What's coming up when you say that is we want things to be adaptive. In other words, we want a system that persists, expands, etc., as you and I have expanded up from the individual archaea or whatever. But we also want a system that's not oppressive. It's actually like good to the individual agents that are in it, right? The individual agents that are in it are enjoying themselves. And similarly, we wouldn't want to plug everybody into a bliss machine when the whole world is collapsing and it's squelching the power of life. Like I think about all of life is like a big blaze. If the blaze is dying out, but people are having a fun time while it's dying out, that feels really silly.
No,
but similarly, if there's a great blaze and everybody's having a horrible time, that also feels really silly. It's like we've got to do both, and this involves the kind of coordinative work that you think a lot about. I want to ask one really quick thing about the coordinative work. You've painted this Gaic vision, and you mentioned Desjardins, and when I think about that future, there's some interesting other thinkers like David Pearce, who I don't know if he's ever come across your radar there. Think about some of this Gaic kind of life getting along. They don't use the same terms you use. I like your pro-sociality and some of these terms. I look outside and I say, okay, what would the world look like if kind of there was a more Gaic coordinative sort of thing going on? There's two things that stick out to me, and I bet you've thought much more about this than, all but, maybe nobody in the world. One, I look out at nature and I say, I don't know if it would be possible to remove all the predators or all the parasites and still have the ocean be blue and teeming with life and the forests be green and teeming with life and enough food for humans to do what they're doing. Could we get rid of the predators that eat things and make them kick alive while kicking and screaming? And the parasites serve a role too. Like that's a first. I have a second question as well, but I wonder if we could tackle that. Like, how would you see Gaic visions coming together, given the fact that the knitting together, at least on the organic level, is quite predicated on a pretty brutal fecundity?
Well, I wouldn't do any of the things that you described, and not to use our human-centric notions of a predator and parasite and try to get rid of them or anything like that. I think that, and as I said before, if you look inside our healthy bodies, you find all kinds of death. You find, including programmed death, which is self-suicide, by the way, and all kinds of competitive processes and so on and so forth. And if you look at our microbiomes, I think is fascinating, because on the one hand, that's not just our genes; that's a whole ecosystem of many billions of microbes. But still, because those microbiomes survive and reproduce as we survive and reproduce, they have evolved also to be mutualistic. And so really, when we think of why we're a healthy organism, it's only thanks to not just our genes, but to our microbiomes. All of those include predators and parasites and viruses and all of these kinds of things. So it's the system that sustains itself. And in the human case, I think this is something that is maybe quite distinctively human, dating back to our hunter-gatherer days, that when you ask, how is it that we evolved to be so cooperative at the beginning, especially in comparison to our closest relatives? So like there's a big difference between chimpanzees and humans in the degree of just naked aggression that takes place inside a community. And when you see what's responsible for that difference, what you find is a high degree of social control. And so basically, human groups are really good at controlling bullies. The Donald Trump, if Donald Trump existed in a hunter-gatherer society, he'd just be offed. He'd be exiled or killed. And Richard Wrangham, an anthropologist at Harvard, and Christopher Boehm, who's passed away, are responsible. They call it reverse dominance. And so what you get is the soul of being human, you might say. This is something that's part of the essence of being human, is on the one hand, nobody tells me what to do. Nobody's the boss of me, okay? But on the other hand, we do what we decide to do. And so there's a communal dimension to it and a stubborn individualistic perspective to it that are like yin and yang. They go together. And so if you fast forward to what we call the classical liberal tradition, and people like John Stuart Mill and others, Alexis de Tocqueville at that point, talking about democracy and so on and so forth, they were actually encapsulating the same thing, that on the one hand, human society needs to be voluntary. I'm a member of this society is because I want to be. I wasn't coerced into it. I wasn't like somebody that was gang-pressed to be on a crew on a ship or drafted into the army. I'm in this society voluntarily. And at the same time, if it's going to work well as a society, we have to do things together. And so that means not everything goes. Not everything goes. So in this kind of cooperative society, We agree that we want to be in it, happy to be a citizen, even to regard it as sacred, even to die for it. But we chose to do it, and we share the benefits. That's the core human society that needs to expand. And as we go to the question of what do we want over the large scale and the long term, we want that scaled up.
Yeah. And it sounds like we see different balances of that yin and yang you just talked about in different civilizations, right? South Korea is a little bit different than, America in terms of the balance between individualism and collectivism in the sorts of ways that you've addressed here. And I imagine it manifests in all kinds of other interesting ways too. It sounds as though for you, in the world of nature, of maybe animals that don't have the rational ability to have these kinds of agreements, let the lions eat the zebras and let the wasps, do whatever they do to the caterpillars, and let the, killer whales do whatever they do to the seals. But in our society, the kind of competition in like economic or physical terms or whatever is maybe not good. So maybe it should be permitted among things that couldn't maybe have imagined other things, but maybe shouldn't be permitted among species that can imagine other things. Is this fair-ish? I'm trying to put a thumb on sort of where you're landing here about this problem of this issue of suffering.
Basically we're getting to the nature of moral systems and why morality is something which is a thing for humans, a very big thing, and not so much for other species. And so long ago, I had a beautiful conversation with a philosopher named Simon Blackburn. And I began by asking him, Simon, before we talk about morality from an evolutionary perspective, just define morality for me as you would in an intro philosophy course. And he said, well, there's two dimensions to morality. There's a compulsory dimension. We have norms, and we expect you to abide by those norms. And if you don't, there's consequences, okay? And then there's a voluntary dimension, our impulse to help others, fueled by sympathy, love, compassion, and all of these positive emotions. So those are the two dimensions of moral systems. And I love that so much because it's exactly what you'd expect from an evolutionary perspective. And the reason that there needs to be a compulsory dimension is to protect the voluntary dimension. If you didn't have the compulsory dimension and you were like, a good Samaritan, well, how is that going to go? But with the compulsory dimension, you can express your pro-social impulses to the fullest and you will not be exploited. You will not be harmed by being a pro-social individual. So that's the package of moral systems, is the compulsory dimension. And it's only thanks to that groups function well at the group level. If you don't have that, then it just dissolves back into some kind of war of all against all.
And you have, in your work around pro-sociality, sort of those 8 factors, right? I think one of them is like monitoring agreed upon behaviors as sort of one of the key factors, right? So you've clearly got models to think through this. But yes, I would tend to concur. I would say without any of that whatsoever, we wouldn't have enough predictability to even be able to think in terms of our own. We'd be on our heels all the time with each other in terms of what's going to be happening next, such that it'd be hard to make those more voluntary choices. So to your point, we have the ability to have those norms and voluntary choices. So we'll have that. I guess in this Gaic perspective, would you see, let us just say, in this Gaic perspective, we're all getting along better. Maybe there's even some great machines. Maybe some of these machines merge and there ends up being sentience and other substrates. Everything's kind of getting along. We're not seeing like nuclear wars and terrible stuff. The biosphere is doing what it's doing because, to your point, what are we going to do about the wasps? What are we going to do about the killer whales? We got to just let them do their thing. But we are behaving different than that. Let us say that there's a random species of vole, and this species of vole lives somewhere in Mongolia, and they're not being killed by humans polluting or anything. But as it turns out, like, they're just kind of going away. Like, these voles are getting eaten. Like, there's more foxes. There's less of certain kinds of like shrubbery and cover for them, and they're just getting like eaten or they're kind of they're dissipating. In this Gaic perspective, would all individual species, whether we go all the way down to viruses or something, would all individual species want to be kind of saved and rescued and have a certain number of them persist, or would it be natural for some things to attenuate, some things to transform? What would you see as kind of right and just from a Gaiac perspective, if we could get to kind of a sort of place that you would see as good?
Well, I feel in the first place, I'd like to take the conversation in a different direction, back to the core design principles. But I'll answer this first, and then we can we can do that. And I think that I don't feel like I have a super intelligent answer to that question. And it brings up to basically, why is it that we value biodiversity in the first place? Do we value it for its utilitarian nature because it provides ecosystem services and that's all we care about? Or does it have intrinsic value? In which case we value it for its own sake. And I think many of us, certainly myself, think it has great, it's sacred. It's basically, as life is sacred, and so therefore we should do to preserve as much diversity as possible. But that doesn't mean preserving each and every species, because that's in the first place unrealistic. And I think that what we need to do is if this is our value, if this is something that is part of what we think of as flourishing, is that we want to make room basically for a diverse other life forms as much as we possibly can. Half Earth, my namesake, E.O. Wilson, Edward L. Wilson, has his Half Earth agenda. Let's have half the Earth for us, half for other species. But you can't micromanage what happens in the other species. Species will come and go. They always have. They always will. You can't just state that everyone currently living we have to make some kind of effort to preserve. In the first place, we couldn't do that. We'd have to make more global decisions, so we need to be wise stewards of biodiversity in a more holistic sense than in a reductionistic sense.
And preservation of each exact species with precisely the chromosomal definition of that species for all of eternity, sort of thing. So, let's get into the kind of principles. But it does sound like, I would imagine. It seems to me as though your philosophy does embrace that in a long enough time horizon. If we keep looking at our watch, the horseshoe crabs will either transform into something else or eventually attenuate. And sort of planning for those rolling waves is sort of part of what a mature perspective would be over a long enough time horizon. With that said, moving to a world where there's more coordination, where two things are happening, and I like your framing. The inside world is better. The agents living on the planet are having a better time. And the outside world is better. It's a more adaptive system. Maybe we can bounce over to Mars without hurting anybody and have life kind of flourish in some interesting ways there, and find some exoplanets or some other spacecraft that we could jump off on. And, it's good on the outside. It's good on the inside. But to get there is tough, and it involves aligning things, and it involves innovation, maybe regulation, maybe new thinking. When you think about heading in the direction of that positive trajectory of sort of the greater successor ecosystem that we would hope to emerge, that would be, in your view, vastly more pro-social, what do we need to think about in terms of where we are today and where we get there? Let's bring it down to today.
Well, that's what I want to do, and what I think is pretty arresting. I hope that those listening will agree that this very highfalutin conversation that we've been having can be brought down to earth in an incredibly pragmatic way, that everything we've been talking about basically is relevant to all the groups of our lives. Think of your business, think of any group, and we all participate in many groups. And do you know that in every one of those groups, it's a little social microcosm in which basically it calls for collective action, calls for coordinated action, and that whether that's going well or poorly depends on whether these compulsory aspects of a moral system. It's like a miniature moral a system, and so what we find is that groups vary in the degree to which they've implemented the structure that they need to in order to cooperate. And these core design principles, which are like miniature moral systems, easy to understand, and any group can improve upon. So all of a sudden, we've gone from a highly intellectual conversation to a highly pragmatic conversation that goes not only for the small groups of our lives, but for the planet and everything in between. So we can talk about micro, macro, and meso. That's the whole level. And we have a single set of principles that can help us basically make these groups in the present moment work much better, both internally and in coordination with each other. And one more thing, Daniel, because I want to just share the news that my daughter has become the next mayor of Seattle.
I saw that. Yeah,
and so
that looked pretty
Katie
cool,
Wilson,
huh?
my daughter, and why am I raising it here other than to boast?
Yeah,
but is that I think it's like super interesting to have this conversation and think of it at the level of a city. And a city is an excellent meso level. It's much smaller than the planet, smaller than a nation, but much bigger than a small group or a town or so on. And by the way, let's talk about bioregions, not just cities, but because that brings in the rest of life. And so that's an important thing that we can do. So Seattle, basically, there's Cascadia. That's the bioregion that Seattle is situated within. But either way, if you look at what my daughter Katie or Mamdani in New York City or any other politician, including progressive politicians, what are they running on the basis of? Well, what's their agenda? And that I think gives you a pragmatic version of the flourishing. When you ask me to imagine what I want 10,000 years from now, what do we want for the city of Seattle? So what do we want? We want affordability. We want housing. We want childcare that we can afford. We want transportation.
Sure.
We want equity. We don't want extreme inequality. We don't want it only to be possible for someone earning seven figures to be able to live in the city. These things are pretty easy to list. Achieving them might be hard, but what we want, if we really want this to be for everyone, and not to be some kind of elitist, only for the elites, then that's not too hard to articulate. And there's a lot of commonality in one newscast. The first, actually, after Katie, the election was decided, it was on CNN, I think, and the news anchor played a montage of Katie and Mamdani on their we know what they're saying. Affordability, housing, homelessness, childcare, convergence on what's needed in New York City, what's needed in Seattle, what's needed everywhere. And so isn't it interesting that this philosophical conversation in some ways becomes simpler when it manifests as the political agenda of at least a progressive candidate?
I don't know if there's one political party that has all the answers versus the other. I'm a little bit more in the middle of the road, but I'm with you that I think these things do get vastly more practical. When we talk about today in the city of Seattle with your daughter at the helm or what have you, we can bring these ideas to life. I would say in a city or in an organization, there are a lot of people who've got to work on the boots on the ground day to day. And thank goodness they do, because we've got to make things work in a pragmatic sense. At the same time, David, in any organization or maybe in the founding of a nation, someone probably does think about, to what end? What will this blossom into? What will this become? And so for me, there is actually a reason to say, where would we want this to ultimately lead us? In other words, what would be the outcome? I think affordable housing in Seattle is obviously important. If we look at the grand process of life of which you and I are part, you're a big fan of Darwin, and from what I presume, you're kind of aware that the archaea bubbled up to me and you, and the archaea are going to keep bubbling. It does actually seem like to what end? Where are we guiding this in the broader sphere? So now that we have anchored that, even if it's not where you hang out most of the time, for me, it's maybe call it highfalutin, but I think somebody's got to ask the question: to what end? We've gotten there. We know kind of where you want us to head. And now we can start to think about some of these principles, and some of these principles that from your vantage point and with the lens you look through, maybe are not being exemplified in certain places in the world where they'd want to. If you were to hope we'd build, let's talk, we talk through the principles, but I know you've got opinions we haven't talked about yet about kind of a pro-sociality within these artificial systems. These things are getting way more powerful. They're going to start getting embedded into the world. when you think about governance and the principles you've learned in these kind of Darwinian systems, and you think about what that looks like around policy with these new kinds of intelligences, what would you want the audience to know? These are policymakers, these are innovators. What are some of the interesting lenses to look through to hopefully work towards a future that you would consider better?
So I've written with my co-founder of ProSocial World, Paul Atkins. We've been thinking hard about this, and we've written something called Evolving ProSocial AI. And so I actually, I'm kind of prepared to respond to that question.
Cool.
And to keep it brief, I think the first thing we say is that this is not a technological problem. This is the thing about worldviews, that it all depends on what worldview is guiding the development of AI. And we have a set of 4 worldviews which are part of the problem, and then another 4 worldviews which are part of the solution. And so let me just list
This sounds great. Yeah,
these worldviews. And so you're going to recognize these. These are the 4 worldviews that are part of the problem. Hyper-individualism optimizes for personal efficiency over collective capability. Market fundamentalism assumes market mechanisms automatically produce beneficial outcomes. Anthropocentric dominance treats humans as separate from natural systems. So there's, were there only 3? Let me just check. And technological determinism, the idea that technology is just going to turn out well.
However it turns out.
If that's what's guiding AI development, that's going to lead to what we call the cancer pattern. The cancer pattern. Just as cancer cells are thriving within the organism for a period, then, if cancer cells could talk, they would say, look at how fast we're growing. Everyone should go as fast as us. And so these are the worldviews that will lead to the cancer pattern. And so now for the more pro-social alternatives, conscious cultural evolution recognizes humans can deliberately shape which cultural patterns spread rather than treating technological change as inevitable. Interdependence thinking, recognizing that individual and collective flourishing aren't competing interests, but aspects of a unified process. The capability approach evaluates technology not by whether people can access it, but by whether it genuinely enhances their ability to think, choose, create, connect, and function in what they value. And multi-level selection thinking treats social systems as complex adaptive systems, and so on and so forth. So there's a clear set of alternatives for the worldview that guides AI development, and we know what's going to happen in each of those cases. And if we're guided by that first set of worldviews, it just will not work out well. It will become cancerous. We can say that with a large degree of certainty. And of course, that's the way we're currently heading.
Yeah, well, and so I think you, based on my interaction with your work, you're pretty square about almost, this might be stretching it, but almost like a kind of amorality of things are doing what behooves those things. Things are doing what those things think will persist. Not that you're okay with all ways things could work out, but you tend to think at a systems level. In other words, there are ways to organize the ways we interact. There's ways to bend the ways incentives are structured so that we marshal more of the sets of behaviors that tend to be more pro-social and cooperative in a flourishing way than destructive, dangerous, reckless, etc. And so it's less of like, at least reading some of your work and watching some of your talks, it's been less of like, here's good guys, here's bad guys. Some people are born with horns. Some people are born with halos. We got to make sure that only the halo people that believe in interdependence, only they can run the show. It's like, of course, it's not that. It's like the systems have to be molded in such a way where we would conjure forth more of what we would hope from the future. This is is this a safe presumption? I've taken a lot of this away from
I've been meaning earlier to bring in that there's something that's wonderfully convergent about the evolutionary perspective, or I should say evolution/complexity perspective, because even though we've been dwelling on evolution, it's always complex systems that are evolving, and those complex systems exist in complex environments. So there's a big complexity piece, which has been underplayed a little bit in this conversation. But in any case, the convergence with the evolution complexity paradigm is, as I like to put it, and the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism. Now, you mentioned Spinoza a number of times. Does that reflect your background? Do you have a history background, and what's your kind of religious philosophical background that causes you to mention Spinoza more than once in this?
Well, I love his terminology, the conatus, potentia, potestas, and how he applies them. Potentia is such a better phrase than intelligence. Oh, the AI might have more intelligence. I don't think we care only about that. We care about the unraveling of potentia that we've seen from the sea snail to the human being. So I just like his terms. My deepest philosophical grounding is probably in Emerson. And Emerson is a great sage of kind of the eternalness of change. Emerson is fully and magnificently and thoroughly understands what Lucretius was getting at and those kinds of things. So yeah, I don't have a formal philosophical background, but I would say Emerson's kind of my main grounding, but I have some other philosophers I like to read. Why do you ask?
Well, just to get back to the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism and its correspondence with the evolutionary complexity worldview. First Noble Truths, life consists of suffering. And so check that. We've been talking about that.
Right about that.
Number 2, suffering is caused by craving. Check that. This is by agents of any kind, humans or non-human, basically all striving to survive and reproduce, often at the expense of each other. Number 3, is there a path out of suffering? And then the evolutionary version, check that. There are conditions under which prosociality can evolve. And so that's the fourth noble truth, of course, is the Buddhist path, and the fourth noble evolutionary truth would be the evolutionary path. But I mention it here because it begins, there's something very systemic about it. And I think the way I respond to your question is, it's absolutely true there's no good guys and no bad guys. Everything, good and bad, is a manifestation of a complex system and cannot be solved in isolation. So you can't just promote the good guys and stamp out the bad guys. You have to be much smarter than that. Yes. You have to take a systemic approach. And that, I think, is the evolutionary complexity way. And it's the Buddhist way. So I think that, and then many other religious traditions. But it's nice to note, and also indigenous wisdom. So I think that there's a very lovely convergence of the scientific component of this with other traditions, religious and cultural and indigenous traditions, including Ubuntu. I am because you are. These are all, I think, systemic ways of thinking, including cultures that could never afford to be reductionistic. When you think of the luxury that you could actually sit back and attempt to unravel the actual causes behind things, that whole enterprise, that reductionistic enterprise. There's most cultures where you just can't do that. And so you have to be systems thinkers, pattern thinkers, and which is in ways that are wise, and that we can discover their wisdom, basically, and we can match it up with the modern evolution complexity view.
I think it seems to me to be good that if we have both, right? I don't know if some Apache understanding of sort of the nature of the weather.
I agree totally.
Right. Francis Bacon has been a boon to man.
Yes. Yes and no.
But well, in many regards, Francis Bacon has been a boon to man. But to your point, I mean, pros and cons. All I'm saying is, it does feel as though a mind, like having both hemispheres there. In other words, having some mechanism with which to ardently understand nature, and some way to maybe try to connect the dots in broader pattern matching ways, feels like a combined. It feels like another yin and yang almost in some way.
It is, but what I want to say is that it's only now. Let me spend a few minutes on this because I actually dwell on it quite a lot. So back in the beginning of the Enlightenment, to be a scientist meant emulating Isaac Newton. And so that way, you had to be mechanistic, you had to be mathematical, You had to create a physics of social behavior. So if you look at the whole origins of the neoclassical economic paradigm, it was that we want to be like Newton. And all the way through, you can see that on the one hand, of course, these are powerful methods. They're amazing methods. And yet at the same time, up until very recently, and I'm talking only a few decades, they were de facto denials of complexity, because you can talk about complexity in words, but when you build mathematical equations, something I do, what you find is that they're extremely constraining in the simplifying assumptions they must make to remain tractable. So you might ask the question, getting back to a previous part of our conversation, why is it that it was 2009 that George Akerlof wrote an economics article titled "The Missing Motivation of Economics," and the missing motivation was norms. And so we've been talking about norms as just absolutely fundamental to human society. Evidently, they were missing from economics. Why? Because they were intractable mathematically, that you had to make the assumption of self-regarding preferences, basically, or else you couldn't grind through the math. So that's the degree to which for all of its power, this ideal of this Newtonian ideal was a de facto denial of complexity. And with the experiments, you can only vary at most 2 or 3 factors, and you have to hold everything else constant.
Yeah.
And so everything that we associate with science was also a de facto denial of complexity up until the advent of computers. And then, only then, did we have the capacity to go past this complexity wall, basically, and to model the complex world as it really is. And then we have evolution going past this great constriction now. And that's why what's happening now, this combination of evolution and complexity, is new in the history of science. The last 50 years is more than just 10% of the scientific revolution. We need to see it as paradigmatic and understand what that means as like a new operating system for how we govern our life. That's how new it is, and nobody knows that. You might be shaking your head, but I'm telling you.
I think you're right. I think people don't. I don't think I realized it as much until I read a lot of your work, and it almost strikes me like, you please tell me if I'm wrong. It almost strikes me like an evolutionary process. We once understood nature broadly in terms of patterns, right? Like, wow, the gods do this and these things, and some of that worked, right? It was functional, and it was maybe, it was adaptive. Think about it that way. And then we swung the pendulum this way. We had to reduce everything to what we could write in terms of paper calculations, and we swung this way. And now maybe we have a little bit of both, but we lost too much of this and we gained a little bit of this. And now maybe we're getting somewhere in the middle. And it almost seems like our want to, the Bacon quote, which I think can be seen as dastardly, but I don't think it was intended that way, is that nature to be commanded must be obeyed. Our ability to understand what is going on, whether fluid dynamics, doesn't matter. What is going on, has gone through these Darwinian processes of different swings and different approaches. And it almost feels like that evolution is continuing, and that complexity is hopefully a new set of more accurate powers to better access nature. Does this strike you as the way you think about it?
Yeah, that's more or less the way I think about it, in which AI can be basically an essential tool.
Absolutely.
An essential tool. So done right, of course, we will not achieve Gaia. Although, I was saying this before AI, I was saying we will not achieve Gaia without the internet age. How could you? How could you talk to someone across the world?
Absolutely.
How could I be talking with you if we didn't have those tools? And now we have still more tools in AI, but that done right will be what enables us to achieve the ideal of Gaia, but only if we select for it. So basically, it's not going to self-organize. There's no invisible hand, my friends. And so it's up to us. And actually we have the conceptual tools and the technological tools as long as we adopt the right worldview. And so that's why it's so consequential, why what's happening right now, whether we go this cancerous path or whether we go this more ProSocial path, is the choice in front of us right right now. And whatever 10,000 years from now looks like is going to be based on what happens now. So I think that's
what we're selecting here.
Yep.
What we're selecting here. Yeah. And this is some of the meat and potatoes of your work, is the selection. And again, I like the no angels, no devils. I like we need to look at this as a system and think about how to almost like, there's so much we don't understand. What are the levers that tend to bend complexity in some directions more than others? And you think about those levers. When you look now, I see, as you do, a brute race for economic and military power with AI, and no bounding body around it. You know, with finances, at least I can track money laundering. I can track I can track certain kinds of fraud. I can, there's some coordinative stuff. It's just total Wild West with this technology that might turn out to be something that squashes us in a terrible way. It kind of hurts that broader flame of life.
Let's dwell on these success stories, because you said, there's financial rules and things like that.
Yes.
One of my great colleagues is Guru Madhavan, who's a systems engineer and has a wonderful book on wicked problems. But he says, look at the airline industry. And that started out like the Wild West. And there was just airline fatality. It was terrible. And then gradually now, it's like the safest thing you can do is fly an airplane. And then we have systems. It's not perfect, but my God, talk about a complex system that works well. And that's because everything that goes wrong, not to speak of a airplane crashing, just a swarm of activity around, an absolute swarm of activity around it. And so the procedures, if you've read the checklist manifesto, you know that
yes, of course,
that there's this this wonderful structure that's been built around it that causes it to. And so this, like structure, that's something that an organism has, a healthy organism, so much structure, so many regulatory circuits, so many processes operating in parallel with each other. And if our societies are going to be anything like a single healthy organism, then they have to have that kind of structure. You got to love structure, the right kind of structure. But of course, for everything that works, there's 100 things that don't work. And so, of course, there's all kinds of structure that gets in the way. But it's up to us to orchestrate this process of multi-level cultural evolution. And if we don't, then it will surely go in a cancerous direction. I guarantee it.
Yeah. So now it's about thinking about selection. You've laid out patterns that you believe would lead to cancer, patterns that would be more likely to lead to a general degree of coordination. And of course, that would be the agents have a better time and the whole system is more adaptive. And I think it's very, very hard to disagree with those two big picture outcomes. What would you be aiming to select for? There's general societal stuff I'm sure you could talk about anytime, any place. And you can definitely mention those things, as I'm sure they're essential. But I'm thinking about our audience who's thinking about governing artificial general intelligence and the proliferation of these technologies, maybe in the military or running the economy in different ways or what have you. As these systems get more and more powerful, what might we need to select for in our businesses and national systems, et cetera? And how would we even go about it? It's obviously astronomically complex when you reflect on not wanting to see AGI go wrong, and when you bring your selection lens to bear, what comes to mind for you?
Well, I think that both successes and failures, successes in addition to failures at the meso level. So, AI is being implemented in a jillion different ways, at a jillion different scales. Some of them are failing spectacularly. Others are succeeding spectacularly. And so we could actually answer that question at these meso scales. And I think that what you find on the successful end of the continuum is, in the first place, we do have a system level selection criteria. We're trying to select for whole systems that have a ProSocial mission. Wikipedia is the example that's cited again and again and again. Why does Wikipedia work so well? Well, it's in part because of its core purpose of advancing knowledge. It has a ProSocial core purpose. And that's the target of selection, basically. And they know, for example, that it can't be profit maximizing, because that's just going to tear it apart from the very beginning. And so its entire structure is one which is dedicated to its core purpose, which is ProSocial. if you have another one, like and it can be very pedestrian, very mundane, such as, orchestrating a transportation system for a public school district. And so AI is going to help from that. Well, that's a wicked problem. That has multiple factors and so on and so forth. How are we going to introduce AI into our business in a way that's going to be productive, not disruptive? And what you find is that it has to be, first of all, there has to be some overarching goal, the target of selection. That's what you judge things by. And then, because it is such a complex system, everything has to be provisional. So if you decide to do something, there has to be some oversight as to how it's working. And if it's not working, then you have to do something about it. And then you have to do that again and again and again. And so in evolutionary terms, this is what we call a variation, selection, replication cycle. Every experiment, we have a goal, we're trying to do something, we try stuff out, we compare alternatives, we try stuff out, we see what works, and then we repeat. So that's a variation, selection, replication cycle. It's like a little generation of evolution taking place. And so these VSR cycles have to be spinning at every level. And of course that requires human oversight. And at the end of the day, is this working for us? Is this actually resulting in a business that works well, or a transportation system that works well, or the acquisition of knowledge? That's your North Star. So there has to be a North Star.
That's what you mean selecting for a whole system is the North Star. Is this correct?
Yeah.
Because I want to really grok selecting for a whole system. It's felt like it's clicked for me, and it's a wonderful opportunity to get to bounce it off of you. Is like selecting for a whole system is your objective is a success in this systematic, broader way. Like you set this as the benchmark to which we refer. And so this is when you say North Star, that is setting our anchor as not how much can we win or we win or we win, but like there's a coordination to say, how do we define win? What are we looking to and benchmarking against time and time again? Something that we can line our own incentives up against.
And that could be in a military concept. That could be the whole system is a whole military system that's being really efficient against others. And there is such a thing as a just war, by the way. And I don't know, depending on where you stand, and you might think that we really want Ukraine to do well compared to Russia. You might, but I think
I don't have a super strong opinion.
Well, I don't. I mean, I'm not trying to wedge that in. All I'm trying to say is that the whole system sometimes it has a pro-social goal that everyone can agree upon. At other times, it's embedded within a conflictual situation. But part of the core design principles, part of a moral system, is that if somebody's misbehaving within the system as being anti-normative, something has to be done about it.
Absolutely, there has to be consequences. This takes us to what the AGI. So I've gotten to talk to Stuart Russell and people in the DoD and the AI Safety Institute leadership at Beijing and all those kind of people on the same exact show, and they're all kind of nervous about this arms race dynamic between the Western labs and between the East and between the East and the West itself. Like, what if neither of us want to build a economic military crushing machine that ends up taking away our agency and ends up kind of harming humans and like not being good? What if neither of us want that, but like we're arms racing against that? To your point, the system has to be able to enforce. What strikes me when you're speaking here is that we would need a system coordinatively globally around the development of a technology vastly more powerful potentially than human beings. Where might we even get started there? Are there Darwinian lessons to think about what kicks off a higher order of system coordination from what had been done before? The insects did it. We've done it. What do you think from a Darwinian perspective could even get us to arrive at that higher level? Because some people, David, and I don't agree with this entirely, they say, well, that's a lost cause. There's no standards that could ever be had internationally. That's meaningless. And I don't know if I agree with that entirely, but they're right to say it's hard. What are the Darwinian lessons about how to bubble up to a new level of system?
Well, again, there's success stories that we don't want to ignore. There's international trade agreements, quite a lot of them. There's quite a few international, get back to things like aviation and things like that, where the need to coordinate was so straightforward that the different nations definitely saw themselves as part of one. The International Space Station is another one. So it can be done. In fact, and it's cognitively no more difficult than other large scale. I mean, if you can imagine yourself as a citizen of a nation, you can imagine yourself as a citizen of the world. And there's no more far-fetched to in fact, even less so. But of course, I think a lot depends, and I'm not saying it's easy or even probable, but a lot depends on the worldview, and that the more people adopt a worldview where they actually see an arms race for what it is, and then they're prepared at various levels to act against it, is a part of it. And so it goes on from there. I think it's important to say that this is not different in kind. It's not different in kind than the nuclear arms race, for example. And so I think, and there's a very interesting line of work. John, I'm only barely remembering the names, David Gronsfeld and John Aquila. And these are military strategists, and they have a phrase, no politics, N-O-O, as in Teilhard de Chardin's noosphere.
Yeah, like noosphere, yes.
Noosphere.
Oh, I've actually heard of this. Okay.
No politics, as opposed to...
Lay it on us,
as opposed to real politics. And I was quite impressed that the military establishment, who includes very smart people who understand the need to win the peace in addition to win the war, and so this is a document that I think everyone should be reading as to how various forms of soft politics can actually beat out the hard politics, and if we know what to do. And once again, I think it's a vastly scaled up version of what we can also understand at a smaller scale. Well, just imagine you're part of a small group. 30% of that group are cooperators. They really want to cooperate, and they know how to do it. Well, the 70% are not like that, unfortunately. What can you do? What can be done? And I think actually things can be done. You have to have a certain critical mass, but after that, those cooperators, first of all, they can interact with each other, and then collectively they can do much better than the ones that are not cooperate, and it can go on. Then they can apply sanctions, and they can do things like that, and then ultimately, cooperation is what's most competitive. Altruistic groups beat selfish groups, and so I think that you can actually imagine something, especially at the grassroots level, the very same David Gronsfeld, when I was in conversation with him, and I have a video with John Aquila that I can make available to you, a video podcast.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
He said, first there was the age of empire, then there was the age of nation states. What's next? The age of networks. The age of networks, and it's at this point that you could really imagine something that's quite grassroots. Of course, it has to have some kind of top-down facilitation, just spreading like crazy, and then overtopping the existing national structure. This is possible.
Yeah, and well, I could imagine some ways that might go splendid and some ways it might not, to be honest. I mean, who knows? I guess that's the whole thing about paradigm shifts is you kind of don't know, right? The Darwinian process bubbles up something new, and fecundity isn't all happy-go fun times, right? I mean, fecundity is different things, but to your point, change is possible, is imminent. It does feel like we are entering a new age. I'm certainly congenial with that. I've heard the term new politics, and now I'll have to dig into what they're getting into. I want to crystallize sort of as we wrap here some of the principles that people can think about as they go forward here. You've said, so like setting a goal at the level of the system, that means identifying the broader whole. Again, you've got this Gaiac initial checkpoint. So you see eventually interplanetary rich life that might not even be biological, but there's a checkpoint we got to go through of can we even cooperate here? This is kind of your pragmatic argument. Like, can we even cooperate on this darn planet? And so there's that first. Can we maybe have that as a kind of goal of what that degree of coordination looks like? We've got to have that. We've got to have these iterative cycles of asking, okay, is the development of this tech or this kind of coordination between us getting us more or less of what we said we're steering towards here? Is it doing more of that or less of that? Okay, we need mechanisms for that too. What else do we need in terms of ingredients? Because I want the audience to kind of walk away thinking about some of these principles and chewing on them.
Well, I think that I'm going to shrink it down still further. And when we talk about goals, talk about personal goals. And a lot of what the new paradigm is an expansion of the most effective therapeutic and training techniques called acceptance and commitment therapy and training, which you can think of as a managed form of personal evolution. And so what I'm doing is I'm repeating what you said at a large scale. What are our goals, we said. Now,
Yes.
Just imagine a person asking that question, maybe with the help of a trainer or a therapist, or maybe all by themselves, is, what are my goals in life? What do I really want? What's important to me? And so to have that reflection, and then to say, well, what would I do if I were actually going to realize those goals? You fill that out. And so now you have the inner and the outer. Okay, the inner, the valued goals, the outer, how you would behave to achieve those valued goals, okay? But now you say, well, despite that, there's all kinds of things going on in my head that are pulling me away from my valued goals. And these are things that are not stupid things. These are things that are actually adaptive in a kind of a very limited sense. So I might want a great relationship, but I might also want to control my partner, things like that. I might want to, pay attention, but at the same time, I might want to procrastinate. And what we see is that since we are products of personal evolution, that we've been shaped in ways that actually make sense. We're behaving adaptively, but not in any way that takes us towards our more valued goals. And now, once you understand those and how those lead to counterproductive actions, now you can actually, seeing that, you can commit to working around them in order to achieve your valued goals. So the point I'm making is that this idea of goal setting, having a aspirational, values-laden goal, and then evolving towards that goal is something that can begin, and actually must begin, at the level of the individual person, and then it repeats itself at small groups, large groups, whole systems, so on and so forth. In each case, there's a mindful process of ProSocial cultural evolution, which all gets coordinated with each other. And there's an amazing simplification, basically, the idea that this is scale independent, everything from the individual person to the whole earth, is just an amazing conceptual simplification.
There's a outlandishly famous Confucian quote that currently evades me, but essentially walks down sort of the ladder of coordination to, the individual in a similar way, but I'm not erudite enough to quote it verbatim. But yes, it is kind of remarkable that we're even capable of coordinating at these higher levels. And you made a very interesting point. If we can be a citizen of a nation, then when we used to just pick berries off the tree with 20 people for, tens of thousands of years or 100,000 years, like if we did that, never more than 20 or 50 people, and now there's countries with, hundreds of millions of humans, the conceptual leap to sort of be part of the Earth project is actually less of a jump from now to the Earth, nations to Earth, than it is from what we've already ascended to. I think that's actually a good thing to bear in mind. And I'm trying to, I guess, think about what policymakers thinking about AI. They're building technologies here that are, again, potentially we might not have control of after a certain kind of threshold. And many of them are concerned that these arms races are going to harm us. I'm thinking about other things that come to mind for you, especially in your kind of pro-social AI work that you've been thinking about. What else sort of floats to mind for you? We've got mindsets we want high-level goals that involve the whole system, a Gaiac kind of vision. We need to make sure we're iteratively looking at is what we're trying to do that's improving our condition through this technology initially. Are we getting closer to that or not? What else came up in your work that might help people to think about guiding this technology?
Well, what I find is that if you look at the people that are in the middle of it, and I have some contact, not a lot, I mean, with the masters of the universe that are actually developing these, that some of them do have a sense of what needs to be done. They have the sense that basically they would be nodding in agreement with much of what we've been saying. And then the AI systems that they build and the need for regulation and so on and so forth is something that they would agree upon. And I think one of the nice things about the kind of regulations we're talking about is they're largely self-regulating. That these are groups, these groups that function well as groups. Yes, they're very highly regulated, but they're self-regulated. They're not externally regulated, and so I think that that's something that we could work towards. So I think that to introduce this worldview to those that are really making things happen, it all begins with the worldview, basically, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, so
and
proliferating.
I've also been saying that this is so very new that the people that are actually making things happen, they haven't encountered it yet. They're not closed-minded necessarily. In fact, most of the people I know are very open-minded, but this is so new, it just has not been encountered. And so catalysis of the ideas can have a more potent effect than you might think, just getting people to see it this way. And then if you don't, after your critical mass does, at that point you've captured both the intellectual and the moral high ground. Because if you're not into this, well, that's bad on you. At least we can identify it as something. You can't pretend that it's normative, that it's the way it should be, that things are going to work out that well. That's not available to you anymore. We have just too strong an argument to be made that this will not go well. And if you pursue down this path, well, at least we identify you for what you are, which is part of the problem and not part of the solution. We can name that. So there's a lot about capturing the intellectual high ground, just increasing exposure. I'd love to think that this conversation would be a step in this direction.
Yeah.
And then just basically make this the conversation. And then that will be a step towards the solution.
That's a valid point there. I guess, like, in order to even begin in order to even set a goal at the level of a system, a worldview that paints that as viable, accessible, an option on the table, and maybe even kind of the net best option on the table would almost be a prerequisite, is sort of what I'm hearing from you.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
I think that's hard to argue with as well, David.
I want to insert that when you were talking before about, identities and a global identity being as easy as a national identity and so on.
Yes.
Just earlier today, this is my second podcast. My first one, I was the host, and it was a wonderful gentleman in England who has applied these ideas to his local community on the Thames River. And so he's done wonderful things at the level of his local community. But when I asked him to introduce himself at the beginning, I really wish I could provide a transcript, because he said something to the effect of, well, in the first place, I'm an individual human being, and I'm also a microbiome. I'm also a member of my community. And then he went all the way up to the globe. And simultaneously, all of the above, from micro to meso to macro, that we have to function in all of these different capacities, and it's not that hard. It's really it can become second nature.
Yeah,
and everything that becomes second nature is a little bit challenging before it becomes second nature. So of course there's going to be some kind of learning curve and experiential curve and stuff, but at the end of the day, you can look forward to this being second nature to you.
Yeah, it seems like necessity is the mother of invention. It seems like there is unlike in the year 50,000 BC, there is a bit of a necessity now that we coordinate at a higher level. You didn't have to think of yourself as a citizen of the world to do.
You couldn't imagine it. It was beyond your imagination.
You couldn't imagine it. Yeah, of course. But now, not only is it imaginable, it might be, in many regards, pretty darn necessary for us to not drop the ball and end up going to war over building some,
and we can see that.
super intelligent machines.
Yep.
So, excellent. Well, David, I'm glad we got to shake out some of the practical principles, talk a little bit in the cosmic direction, even beyond kind of where you probably hang out most of the time. But I appreciate you going there.
Thanks for dragging me into the cosmos.
And I'm extremely delighted that I was able to unpack some of the ideas I've already enjoyed learning from so much. So, David, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much.
All right, so that's all for this episode of The Trajectory. This was 18 of our Worthy Successor series. Thank you for tuning in, and a big thank you to David Sloan Wilson for being here with us. I have a bunch of notes, and so I will look at my screen and speak them out a little bit. Lots to talk about here. There's a few things that I really liked about some of David's thinking. So towards the end of the episode, it sort of seemed like, what would he hope for the bigger aggregate system? There was a bit of a lens applied towards the end of the episode around, we would want it to be kind of good on the inside. That is to say, individual agents within the system are treated well. Maybe this is in a utilitarian sense. Maybe this is in a fairness Rawlsian sense. We could kind of debate. We didn't get too far into all of that. But the individual agents are, let's say, having a decent time within this broader expanding ecosystem. And then also, it is kind of good on the outside. That is to say, a flourishing and expansion of possibilities of the total system. And I actually think that 1 and 2 is in large part what a lot of the series has been about. And David actually ended up nutshelling it better than most and better than myself. Even though some of the stretching into the cosmic was a bit of a process in this episode, that was actually pretty darn interesting. I also think his notion of sort of artificial evolution within AI, sort of thinking about it as artificial evolution as opposed to artificial intelligence, is an interesting lens. It seems right that if artificial general intelligence be a part of the flame, the greater expanding process of life, and not just some dead optimizer crushing some economic or military tasks, it will be a sort of artificial evolution. It will have to embody those elements of autopoiesis and hopefully at some point of sentience that we value in the biosphere. I think that lens is actually quite important. And I think intelligence, all terms have their limits. My own analogies are as flawed as any other, but I think artificial evolution is maybe a starting point for discourse around what we would wish for AGI to be. That's potentially more encapsulating of that which we consider valuable, even beyond, let's say, just intelligence. Intelligence is one of the many categories of powers, magazines of powers, opened up from evolutionary processes. Something to bring up about this episode. So my job is to sort of aim to carry the conversation into what I consider to be really crucial components of where things are going. In other words, and you saw in this episode, there was a little bit of a consideration of, well, things after people. I mean, that's millions of years, right? And in my opinion, between brain-computer interface, artificial general intelligence, et cetera, humanity as process, not as frozen entity whose job is to coordinate a kumbaya of the rest of the biosphere, seems actually to be a really hard thing to deny. It is an uncouth topic of discussion, however, and it's also an uncommon topic of discussion. So my purpose, as those of you who've been tuned in for a long time are well aware, is not to bring on folks who I think agree with specifics of the way that I consider the world, but whose ideas are really valuable for the broader audience who's asking, what is a flourishing of the great system? This is ultimately what this channel is about, what this series is about. And so I brought in David for that reason. There were some things I found a little bit tough to square within my own self, and it's possible through more conversation with David, reading of more of his work, although I did a tremendous amount of homework ahead of this episode, I would be able to have more clicks, but there was sort of this notion that, okay, for flourishing, what would it mean? If everything went right, the process could unfold, what would it mean? It was like, okay, we'd have trust, we'd have meaning, we'd have agency, everyone would have a place in it. There would be no kind of colonization. There'd be like a lot of this, I don't know, inclusion or something like that. I think seeing higher orders of coordination is a pretty fair and square way of interpreting what seems to happen as the process unravels. It seems pretty fair and square to me. Multiple cells contributed to the multicellular organisms. Many humans form the city of Austin, the nation of the United States. It seems fair to me. But sort of everyone having a place in it doesn't actually seem super frank and square with what the evolutionary process is. And so, again, it's an uncouth thing. So what you might think I do is I get people to speak out squarely what they think will be the fate of humanity as the process unravels. That's not what I do, because squarely addressing those things behooves almost no one. We can think about the Mike 11 episode, who I respect tremendously, the Richard Sutton episode, who I respect tremendously. We could go on with particular intellectuals, but when garnering their perspectives and then garnering the implications of those perspectives, most likely as we ravel forward, are totally different things. And so I think there is an uncouthness to the fact that cooperation and fighting to stay in the stream of life and all of these things which are part of the evolutionary process are going to exist at different strata. And where that leaves us, I think, is not just inclusion and fairness and a kumbaya among the biosphere. And I'm not strawmanning David's entire philosophy, by the way. He kind of nutshelled it that way, and we only got so far. And when we talked off mic, he was pretty square too. Like, my supposition is there's some of this stuff where it just doesn't, it's not good to talk about what it means, because it's not happy-go-friendly forever. And so it's uncouth. And so again, my job is to tease out the stuff and then show where I think the barrier of uncouthness really is. Like, is there something more real here we should address? I think there was a bit of that. That said, David also mentioned, off mic here, there's a lot of kind of woo-woo stuff in the Gaia sphere of, the world is awake. And, there's a lot of that kind of dulled down some of what were really important and I think really well-grounded areas of his work and his study of applying evolutionary processes. And so it could be also a wariness of that kind of stuff way back in the day was detrimental to the credibility and application of what he's trying to do. And David is clearly trying to apply these ideas in the real world. Again, he has that institute where they apply these cooperative ideas. He's got, I think, 8 core principles or so for that organization. I'll link to it in the show notes. Really, really cool. But there were barriers to crossing some of the stuff into the cosmic. Absolutely regardless, however. So some of those things were subtly incompatible from my vantage point. Again, the sort of everybody has a place, no colonization, and it continues to be evolution. Tough one for me. But I really recommend digging into David's work. I think that seeing technology as evolutionary, seeing culture as evolutionary, in our conversation, I was thinking to myself, there will be new religions. David has such cool stuff about religion, by the way. There'll be new religions based on, a fear of or an attraction to artificial general intelligence, and they won't necessarily be true. They will be adaptive. There will be different groups that end up being more adaptive based on that new strata of kind of coalition. I hope David's right, and we actually have a pretty good amount of time until we have to cross some of those roads. But man, I see some of that stuff coming, and I think David's lens of perspective is very, very valuable. So again, my job is always to try to nudge things to the cosmic, but also to bring you the perspectives of people who I think have ingredients that I don't have that would be valuable for the conversation of what is flourishing of the system, of the greater process. And David is an exemplar there. So big thanks to David again for being with us, and I look forward to catching you the next time here on The Trajectory.